July 31st, 2005, Ya'an City, Sichuan Province. It was a quiet summer morning when something unusual drew the attention of early risers outside a small grocery store on Longquan West Street. The store was usually open by 5:30 a.m. sharp. Its owner, Ms. Wang Fengjia, was known for her kindness and punctuality. But that morning, the shutters remained closed. No lights, no movement. Just silence. A few neighbors knocked. No answer. Then someone noticed something strange trickling from underneath the rolling metal door. At first they thought it might be spilled paint, but the color was darker, thicker. One woman knelt down, touched it with trembling fingers, and recoiled. It smelled like blood. Within 15 minutes, the police arrived and forced the door open. The smell hit them first, and then just beyond the entrance lay the lifeless body of an elderly man face down, soaked in blood. Farther inside, on a bed tucked behind a blood-stained curtain, they found a second victim, a woman mid-30s stabbed multiple times, still wearing her night clothes. No sign of struggle, no robbery in sight, no forced entry. A double murder, right inside a beloved neighborhood store. But that wasn't what haunted the detectives the most. It was what they couldn't make sense of. Why was a large sum of cash left untouched in plain sight? Why were there 2 unopened cups of instant noodles sitting quietly on the living room table, prepared but never eaten? And why did the crime scene feel calm? This wasn't just a robbery. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message, a mystery sealed behind a shuttered storefront. And one question echoed louder than the rest. Who walked in through an open door, locked it shut, and disappeared without a trace? Before the bloodstains and shuttered doors, before the headlines and hushed whispers, there was only Wang Fengjia. She was 34, soft-spoken, warm-hearted, known in her neighborhood not just as a shopkeeper but as someone who cared. Her small convenience store, just a modest shop tucked into Longquan West Street, was famous not for its size but for her generosity. She gave discounts to the elderly, free items to struggling neighbors, always a smile, always a kind word. It wasn't just a business, it was a heartbeat in the community. And by her side for the past 3 months was her father-in-law, Tu Jiang. He was 62, retired but strong and sharp. After her husband suffered a work accident that left him wheelchair-bound and temporarily moved back to his mother's house for care, Mr. Tu had stepped in to help Fengjia manage the shop and household. Every morning they opened together before dawn. Every evening they closed shop side by side. But on that final morning, July 31st, none of that routine happened. Police forced open the door at 9:20 a.m. What they found was chaos behind eerie silence. Mr. Tu was lying just inside the front door. He had been stabbed 11 times, most savagely in the chest, the blade piercing directly into his heart. His white undershirt was soaked through. There were signs of blunt force trauma to his head, likely from a steel rod later found hidden under a display shelf, still wrapped in newspaper and smeared with dried blood. Farther inside the store, in a small upstairs loft used as a bedroom, officers found Ms. Wang. She was still in her nightgown, her body limp on the bed. She had been stabbed 17 times, primarily in the chest. No signs of struggle, no indications of a break-in. Her clothes were intact. Her body showed no signs of sexual assault. A blood-spotted towel sat neatly folded near her pillow, a basin of water beside the bed. It appeared she had been running a fever, possibly sleeping through the entire ordeal. The apartment was ransacked, cupboards flung open, a vanity drawer pulled out. Clothing scattered across the floor. The cash drawer had been broken into, and a few loose banknotes lay on the ground. And yet, remarkably, on the floor beneath the bed, police recovered a black plastic bag containing approximately 30,000 yuan in cash, untouched. Next to the living room table were 2 instant noodle cups, opened, seasoning added, but no hot water poured in. They hadn't been eaten. Beside the cups, a metal thermos sat unopened. To detectives, it was both a clue and a contradiction. If this was a robbery, why wasn't the cash taken? If it was planned, why the instant noodles? And why was everything so methodical, so calculated yet rushed? Even more intriguing, there was no sign of forced entry. The rolling shutter showed no damage. No lock was broken. It was as if the perpetrators had been welcomed in. or simply arrived before closing time. An elderly neighbor across the street, Ms. Jia Ming, told police she'd seen the lights on around 10:30 p.m. the previous night. Odd considering Ms. Wang and Mr. Tu usually went to bed early, but she'd thought nothing of it. Then came the smell of blood the next morning. The crime shook the entire city. People didn't just lose a kind shopkeeper or a respected elder. They lost a sense of safety. And for officers on the case, one question lingered. Was this about money or something far more personal? Over the next few days, investigators cataloged every inch of the crime scene. Every scratch on the drawer, every fingerprint on the noodle cups, every shoe print in the dried blood. A forensic report soon confirmed the steel rod had likely been used to bludgeon Mr. Tu. The pattern on his scalp matched the shape, and the blood found on a nearby shopping bag matched his DNA. But the real mystery: how could someone go through all this effort, kill two people, and forget to take the money? Unless they hadn't forgotten at all. Unless the cash was never the point. From the moment officers stepped out of that blood-soaked shop, the investigation began under a cloud of confusion. No signs of forced entry. 2 instant noodle cups with unfamiliar fingerprints. A weapon wrapped in newspaper left behind. And 30,000 yuan in cash that no one had taken. Detectives were caught between 2 theories. Was this a robbery interrupted? Or a personal vendetta disguised as one? To find out, they divided into 2 teams. One team focused on the victim's social circles, family, neighbors, past disputes. The other hit the local hardware stores, asking one question: had anyone purchased a steel rod recently? They got a lead. At a hardware store 3 kilometers away, a clerk remembered 2 masked men buying a steel rod on the night of July 30th. Both wore caps. Both spoke with a local accent, but it was dark. He couldn't recall their faces, and the store had no security cameras. Another dead end. So detectives turned their attention to the fingerprints. They had found 2 partial prints on the noodle cups, one clearer than the other. Back in 2005, fingerprint analysis in smaller cities still relied heavily on visual comparison. That meant manually cross-referencing the prints with known offenders in the area. Days passed. Hundreds of records were pulled. No match. Investigators were frustrated but not deterred. They revisited the victims' personal lives. Wang Fengye, they learned, had recently been seen with a man who wasn't her husband. A neighbor, Ms. Jia Ming, described him as tall, muscular, early 40s. The two had often left the house together. Too close to be just friends, she said. Was this the motive? Police eventually tracked down the man. His name was Chen Kai, alias a migrant worker from Yunnan province. He said he met Ms. Wang while driving a motorbike taxi. She needed help transporting goods to and from the market. She was kind to him, paid him well, even offered him part-time work at her store. He swore there was nothing romantic between them. Police checked his alibi. On the night of the murders, he'd been drinking at his boarding house with several other workers. Witnesses confirmed it. The compound's gates locked at 11:30 p.m. every night, and records showed no one left after that time. Chen Kai was ruled out, but then another person caught investigators' attention. Tu Lin, alias the youngest son of Mr. Tu Jiang and brother-in-law to the murdered Ms. Wang. On the night of the murder, Tu Lin had gone drinking with friends. When officers arrived to notify the family, he didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he casually mentioned plans to meet friends again that evening. It wasn't grief, it was indifference. Undercover officers followed him to a bar the following night. They sat close listening, and what they heard shocked them. "I don't care they're dead," Tu Lin said, slurring. "They deserved it." Detectives brought him in for questioning. Tu Lin, still half drunk, looked confused as he sobered up in the interrogation room. At first, he denied knowing anything. Then, reluctantly, he revealed his deep resentment. He suspected without proof that his father and sister-in-law were having an affair. He'd seen them eating together, laughing, spending more time alone since his brother's accident. When his mother and brother dismissed his concerns, he felt humiliated, forgotten. Still, Tu Lin had an alibi. That night, he'd been working the night shift at a factory. Time-stamped entry logs and co-worker testimony confirmed it. He was bitter, but not the killer. And once again, the case hit a wall. 2 deaths, no suspects, no clear motive, and no one coming forward. Months passed, then years. The file was boxed labeled unsolved and placed on a cold shelf left to gather dust like so many others. But what no one knew then was that a fingerprint left behind on a cup of instant noodles would one day crack the case wide open. It just needed time. For over a decade, the case went cold. Detectives had chased down every rumor, every whisper, but there was no suspect, no confession, and nothing conclusive enough to bring closure. The neighborhood slowly moved on. The shop remained boarded up. No one wanted to rent a place where such horror had occurred. The once lively corner of Long Quan West Street had become a ghost of its past. Then, in the fall of 2017, 12 years after the murders, a petty thief made a mistake. His name was Zhang Yong, alias. He was caught red-handed attempting to steal from a parked bicycle near a local market. Furious citizens restrained him and handed him over to police. At first it seemed routine, a minor theft, another unemployed man down on his luck. But then something unexpected happened. As officers processed his fingerprints, the system flagged a match. It wasn't a new crime. It was a cold case. Zhang's fingerprint matched one of the two partials recovered from the noodle cup in the 2005 double homicide. The cup that had been sitting quietly in evidence storage for 12 years. Suddenly, this small-time thief was facing questions about murder. Zhang denied everything. He insisted he had never been to that store, never been involved in any violent crime, never heard of Wang Fengjia or Tu Jiang. But detectives had something they didn't have in 2005, time-tested interrogation techniques and leverage. They dug into his background, found his family in his hometown in Guizhou province. Elderly parents, a sick father, no stable job, no savings. They spoke to him softly. They reminded him that confessing could earn him leniency. That truth, even when late, was better than lies. After nearly 5 hours in the interrogation room, Zhang broke. He confessed. But he wasn't alone. Zhang revealed that 2 other men were involved in the murder, Liu Qiang and Li Zhong aliases. All 3 were childhood friends from the same rural village. None of them had higher education. All of them had struggled to find steady work. They drifted from factory to factory, job to job. Nothing stuck. They hated working, hated being broke, hated feeling small. So they decided to get rich the fast way. Robbery. According to Zhang, the plan had been simple. They would target a small business that handled cash, where security was minimal and escape routes were easy. Zhang had once passed through Ya'an and remembered the grocery store run by Wang Fengjia and her elderly father-in-law. It seemed ideal, small town, no cameras, an elderly man working late. They traveled to Ya'an in late July 2005. On July 30th, they bought a steel rod and 2 small knives at a nearby supply shop. To avoid suspicion, they asked the clerk to wrap the items in newspaper. That night, they waited until just before closing time. They approached the store and asked for food, claiming they'd been working all day and hadn't eaten. Mr. Tu, ever the kind soul, invited them in and prepared instant noodles for them. As he turned to fetch hot water, one of the men quietly locked the metal shutter from inside. Then it happened quickly. Zhang bludgeoned Mr. Tu with the steel rod. As the elderly man stumbled toward the door, another man, Li Zhong, stabbed him repeatedly until he collapsed in a pool of blood. Liu Qiang moved through the store searching for valuables. He entered the bedroom and found Ms. Wang asleep, pale with a wet towel on her forehead. She was clearly ill, vulnerable. For a moment he hesitated, but then he drew his knife. She never even opened her eyes. They looted the house drawers, dressers, cabinets. They found 30,000 yuan in a plastic bag, then left it behind in the chaos. Zhang later admitted that Li Zhong was so nervous he completely forgot to take the cash before locking the shutter on their way out. The only money they escaped with, 2,000 yuan, not even enough to buy a bus ticket home for all 3. But it wasn't just their stupidity that undid them. It was their fingerprints. Police moved quickly. They coordinated a 2-city arrest effort, sending officers to Guangzhou and the suspect's home province. Liu Qiang was caught during dinner with his family. Li Zhong tried to flee, stole a motorbike, and ended up being arrested 2 days later, ironically, while trying to steal food from a bakery. Back in Ya'an, all 3 men were placed in the same interrogation room. Zhang stared at them in silence, then calmly said, "I already told them everything." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, the others confessed too. And just like that, a case that haunted a city for 12 years finally had names, faces, and a chilling truth. 3 men, 1 shop, 2 innocent lives, and a mistake they couldn't take back. On July 27, 2018, 13 years after the crime, the courtroom in Ya'an City filled with people, reporters, residents, police officers, and families of the victims. They came not just for justice, but for closure. Zhang Yong, Liu Qiang, and Li Zhong were escorted in shackled at the ankles, heads lowered. They looked thinner, older, quieter than the monsters the public had imagined, but the charges against them were devastatingly clear. Premeditated murder, robbery, and unlawful possession of weapons. The prosecution laid out the timeline with surgical precision, every step of their plan, every item they purchased, every wound inflicted. Evidence from 2005 was presented again, this time paired with confessions and modern forensics. The steel rod blood-smeared and bent, the knives found in Li Zhong's belongings years later, the fingerprints on the instant noodles, the medical examiner's reports, 17 stab wounds to Ms. Wang, 11 to Mr. Tu, and perhaps most damning, Zhang's taped confession played for the court. Their motive, money, plain and simple. And yet, they left behind more than they took, that the prosecutor said proved this was more than just a botched robbery. It was careless brutality. In their defense, the accused offered no justification, only quiet regret. Their lawyers requested leniency, citing poverty, desperation, and lack of education. But for the court and the families left behind, those weren't excuses. They were reminders of what happens when desperation turns into violence. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors who remembered Ms. Wang's kindness, a friend who had once borrowed money from Mr. Tu only to have him refuse repayment. The community had not forgotten. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom fell silent. The judge reviewed each defendant's role. Zhang, who wielded the steel rod, Li, who delivered the fatal stabs, Liu, who entered the bedroom and ended Ms. Wang's life. All 3 had conspired. All 3 had killed. The verdict, death sentences for each. No appeals, no delays. The court moved swiftly. Outside, a crowd gathered. News had spread. Some wept, others stood still. A few quietly lit incense and placed fruit at the doorstep of the now abandoned store, an old Chinese gesture to honor the dead. Inside the courtroom, the families sat still. Tears flowed, but not out of vengeance. It was grief finally allowed to breathe. After the trial, the lead investigator gave a short statement to the press. "We never forgot this case," he said. "Not a single day." The judge's closing remarks were brief but firm. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and sometimes justice must come late to come at all. In the years since the murder, no one had dared reopen the shop. It remained sealed, the rusted shutter, a daily reminder of what was lost. Even as real estate prices rose in the neighborhood, that storefront stayed unsold, untouched. They say ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt memory. And in Ya'an, the memory had never really faded. The justice system had done its job, but a question remained. What makes a person so desperate that they see a warm meal, a kind face, and an open door, not as kindness, but as opportunity? When the trial ended and the crowd dispersed, Ya'an City didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It exhaled years of silence. The case had been solved. The killers were sentenced. But peace, that would take longer. For the family members left behind, there was no celebration, only quiet acknowledgement that the nightmare had at last come to an end. Wang Fengya's younger brother told reporters, "She never deserved that fate. She was the kind of person who would give you food even if she had none left for herself." And that's exactly what she did. On the night of her death, she welcomed 3 strangers in from the street, offered them a meal, showed them warmth, and for that, she was betrayed. Her father-in-law, Tu Jiang, had stepped in to help her while his son was recovering from a tragic accident. He worked quietly behind the scenes, never seeking praise, just helping family. They both died not out of conflict, not out of vengeance, but because someone saw their kindness as an opening to exploit. And that's perhaps the most haunting part. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't personal. It was cold, calculated, opportunistic. Three men with nothing to lose looking for fast money turned a family-run corner store into a crime scene. And for 12 years, they almost got away with it. Almost, because of one fingerprint. Just one, left behind on a cheap cup of instant noodles. That tiny trace missed by them, preserved by investigators, became the crack in their story. The thread that, when pulled, unraveled everything. It's a reminder of how fragile justice can be, and how powerful persistence truly is. The officers who handled the case never gave up, even when the case went cold, even when resources were limited, even when the years stacked up. They kept the files open, they preserved the evidence, they waited for science to catch up. And when it did, they were ready. Today, the store at 57 Long Quan West remains empty. Locals say no one wants to move in, not because of superstition, but out of respect. That ground is sacred now, tainted and honored at the same time. In the years since the arrests, law enforcement across China has invested more in forensic technology. Cold cases are being reopened. Databases are being expanded. Because if one fingerprint could bring justice after 12 years, how many others are just waiting to be found? There's no happy ending here, only justice and reflection. Some in the neighborhood still leave fruit or incense near the shutter. Others just walk past a little faster. But every once in a while, someone new asks why that shop is still closed. And someone else answers with the story. Not of a murder, but of a woman who was kind, of a father who stepped up, and of a city that refused to forget. Justice may come late, but memory never leaves. What do you think? Was this case truly about poverty or about something deeper? A mindset that views vulnerability not with empathy, but as opportunity? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more true crime stories the world still needs to hear, and some that are still waiting for answers.